This is Patrick Hickey. I'm doing the summary of Kevin's paper. It is on globalization. Paper starts off with the connection. You bring a connection to imperialism and globalization, and how they're similar. And I think that's a really good start. I think it shows they're very good and they come together really well. So to start off like that, I think is well done. Next, globalization. You talk about how globalization refers to the unified ideology. I really like that this comparison you make and how you talk about most countries are considered to be liberal. I think that's that's a great connection. It's pretty obvious, and you can see it today. You go on to list some of the countries that aren't liberal, such as like Cuba, who are still communist. Cuba, China, Vietnam, North Korea, some of the countries that are considered to be communist. So I think that's a really good job of backing it up to start off. The paper then moves on to the different beliefs that theorists of globalization have of how it started. Talk about Fukuyama and how he believes it started after the fall of the Soviet Union, whereas some theorists have belief that it started at the time of the French Revolution. So you bring in a little history on globalization, which I think is nice, and the theory and where it comes from. So I think that was really well done. Next, it moves on to talk about, you try to make the connection, or you talk about how fascism and communism are kind of competitors to liberalism, and how you use a really good quote here that says, with fascism and communism defeated, liberal democracy is the one ideology that remains. I think this is a great quote. It really helps defend the point you're trying to make here. You really go into detail pretty good about what makes communism and fascism different than liberalism. I mean, besides everybody I think kind of knows that they're different, but you really kind of go into detail and you explain. So I think you did a good job there. Next, like I said, you talk about China and you make connections, since you're talking about fascism and communism, how they're opposite of liberalism. You go into details about certain countries. And what you talk about China and how they are changing their ways of communism, but they're doing it slowly. They haven't caught up to much of the rest of society, as some other countries, as we know as well, in the Middle East, are not as modern or as like the United States or many of those other European countries. So I think it's a good job of going to that and giving different like examples of communism. Next paragraph, you're discussing theory. You go into the wave of globalization, as it's worded in the paper, and the influx of countries from different years of how they start to fall into this theory of globalization. But you didn't really, I don't think I saw like a source there, but you have how many countries were like, were part of globalization. So I don't know if you want to add a source in there or not, but if that's really something you can quote. But it seemed like it seemed like a fact the way you wrote it, where you had the years and how many countries were. So I think maybe you should put a source in there. Next, the paper talks about. Next, you talk about the signs of globalization in the economy. So this is where you kind of transition from government-focused communism, liberalism, to discussing globalization in the economy, which is still, I guess, government, but this is a different perspective of it. So goes in the paragraph to talk about interdependence and how it can develop. There's a quote. It says interdependence. You quote, interdependence can develop in the absence of interdependent states, but globalization depends upon the globalized state. I think that's a really good quote, but as I continue to read, you really didn't explain that too much. I mean, you explained a little bit about interdependence, I think, if I remember, but you really didn't give much, I would necessarily say, much of an explanation about what that quote means. So I think maybe to make it a little easier, you could do that. You could explain it a little better, but I thought that was a good quote for sure. Next part of the paper, you talk about Fukuyama again, and his belief in how he questions, and you question whether or not he says that we are living at the end of history, and you now question that in this paragraph, and you bring up a lot of good points of what that means. You bring up a lot of good points showing that we aren't, like, why we are not living at the end of history compared to what he says that we are. I think that's great. You come up with an opposite opinion. I think that really opens up globalization and the kind of the paper a lot, or paper well. Next, you go on to talk about how Islam and liberalism are resistant to one another. So once again, you're making connections between you. First off, you started with liberalism and communism or fascism, and now you're making a connection between Islam and liberalism and how they're different. So there's a lot of good quotes in here that really help back up your claims. I thought that was really well written in your paper, is that in these first few paragraphs, you backed up what you were saying with good quotes, and the quotes made sense and they fit the paper very well. So I think that's good. I think you should keep doing that. Next paragraph, you go on and you try to make a connection with the U.S. and globalism. So you talk about you kind of give your opinion on the relationship of the Middle East and the United States, and how you say how that they should not have gotten involved in the change in the Middle East. We should have just let it happen take its own route. So I think that's great. You have your own opinion and you're throwing your own opinion. I don't know if that's necessarily. I don't know if that's a great idea or not, but you give your own opinion, which I think is different. There could be a lot of. So I think that was nice to throw your own opinion there, but I'm not necessarily sure if that works best in the paper. Next, you talk about Fukuyama and this theory about how the end of history connects to Muslims combating Westernization. So you take Fukuyama's theory that we are living in the end of history, and you connect that, and you use examples of Muslims combating Westernization in modern times. So you bring it to, I think that was a really good connection. You used that well. The movie you cover now is what you used for this is The Hunger Games. I've seen it, so I kind of know I know a lot about it, so I kind of was able to understand where you're coming from or the connections you use in the paper. So it starts off with globalized society where we're all living in districts that the further you get out, the poorer the districts, the less they have. And so it starts off with Katniss and the reaping. She has her sister. They're going to the reaping. The reaping is when they choose two volunteers for two tributes from each district to go and fight in the Hunger Games to the death. There's only one winner that comes out of it. So, and this is a famous quote, like you mentioned in the paper, where Katniss volunteers as tribute when her sister is picked. Her little sister Prim is picked. So so the movie goes from there. You mentioned that you might want to put in a map of the districts here. I don't think you necessarily should do that or need to do that. I think it's fine the way the paper is for there, so I don't think you should throw that in here. Next, so she gets picked. Her and PETA are picked from their district to go. Now, the movie kind of focuses on Seneca. You talk about Seneca Crane's role in the movie. So Seneca is the games maker. He creates the map and what kind of goes on in the arena of the Hunger Games. You talk about how he represents totalitarianism governance. I don't necessarily think I think President Snow is more of a representation of totalitarian governance, not Seneca. Seneca Crane really is just the games maker. He's just creating the arena. He does have a decent part that you can make connections with, but truly I think you using President Snow as your example here and not Seneca. So I think you should go back and make sure you're using Snow instead of making connections between the totalitarianism with Snow, because he's the one in charge. He's the ruler of, he's the head of the capital. Now you talk about the connection between the flag and the capital of the flag and the swastika of like Nazi Germany. I think that's a great analogy because it's pretty similar. It's very well like it is very similar to that. So I think that's great to bring up, and I thought that was a really good part of the movie that it does actually sort of represent it's supposed to, but the flag does represent a very strict communist like totalitarian government. Little note, I think it was the first line of page 7. There's a little bit of grammar mistake I noticed. You wrote president instead of president. There's just a little small detail I noticed that you probably want to go back and fix. Now you go on to talk about the totalitarian theory in the movie, that how it doesn't support Fukuyama's claim that liberalism is a stronger ideology, and that's definitely correct. I mean, the movie is pretty much all about a totalitarian government and how they controlled people with the Hunger Games, that they use it as a way to suppress the people, to remind them that when they tried to rebel, that the government is in charge. They use it to punish them, to keep them in line, and that is extremely totalitarian, and there's no liberalism whatsoever going on. But as the movie goes on, Katniss becomes pretty much represents liberalism in the movie. She is a glimmer of hope for the people who are oppressed, all those people who are just struck down by the government, all in the district sides. And so that's a great representation I noticed that you made in the movie. I think you should talk about that, how Katniss represents kind of globalization and liberalism. She is the glimmer of hope for all the people. Next, once Katniss and Peeta end up winning, Seneca changes the rules a little bit. They instead of having one winner, Katniss and Peeta decide they both are going to die, or Seneca changes the rules so that they both end up living. This angers Snow because Seneca has now allowed Katniss and Peeta to show up the capital and kind of prove that there is a little bit of hope there, that the capital isn't all overbearing and controlling like they want to be. They want to be feared, and like in the quote, Snow says, "Hope is the most dangerous thing that the capital could face," and that is exactly what Seneca allows Katniss and Peeta to be, is hope for those people, for a rebellion possibly in the future. And as we see in the future movies, they do end up rebelling. So that's a key point in the movie, and actually that's where I think you should really talk about Seneca, is how he allows Katniss to become a glimmer of hope. If without him allowing those two to live, then the Hunger Games don't happen, the rebellion doesn't happen. So I thought it was pretty that you should talk about that too. I mean, that pretty much sums up the movie. Any critiques I had, little critiques I thought, were the second and third paragraphs. I think you should condense those into one. A lot of real small paragraphs that I think you can fit back into other paragraphs, so you don't have so many. I mean, it's not bad to have so many paragraphs, but a lot of them they could have been, especially second and third. I think they should be one paragraph instead of two. So a couple little grammar mistakes here and there, but I mean that's nothing to be really worried about. There's nothing crazy, just notice a few. It's about it. I think you should focus more on President Snow instead of Seneca Crane as the representation of totalitarianism and governance. So I think that's about it.